Hello everyone and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today I am going to go through every rumoured player to be leaving their club in this off-season and doing a potential trade that each team could potentially be happy with, sort of going through what they might give up and what they might have to get in return as well, because as we know, teams like to hold out on players, and one in particular is Zach Merrett, so we might as well get started straight with him. He's very much going to Hawthorn, as much as their new president, Andrew Walsh, has come out in the media and said himself that Zach Merrett will not leave. But what would a trade potentially look like? I think for Hawthorn, you look at their current picks. It's pick around 9 after all the compensations being Allen and TDK. No TDK for the Hawthorn pick. But then you look at James Worpel, and that situation's really interesting because there's every chance he leaves to Geelong. And at the moment, there's no real surety at what the compensation pick would be if Hawthorn don't match it, but that's if they don't match it. There's every chance Hawthorn do, and that forces a trade. At the moment, I would be leaning towards them not matching it, and that probably results in the compensation pick probably end of first round, maybe start of second round, so early 20s. And then they've also got pick 32. 9, 23 and 32 probably isn't enough. They'd probably want maybe an extra first or a young player, and that's where Henry Hustwaite comes in. So in a straight swap deal, I would have Hustwaite, pick 9, 23 and 32, all going to Essendon in return for Zach Merrett. However, a lot of trades nowadays with these superstars do tend to be involving other teams, and that's where an expansion might happen with a team potentially like Gold Coast, who want more picks, so could be wanting that pick 23 and then might give up their own first. To potentially get a few picks in return, because Essendon do have 2 early second round picks. So it could be where Gold Coast Port Adelaide first round pick this year goes to Essendon in exchange for those 2 second round picks, as well as that pick from Hawthorn, because that sort of matches the value. So Hawthorn would still be giving up those 3 picks in Hustwaite to get Merrett. Essendon would be giving up Merrett and their 2 second round picks, and they'd be getting pick 7, pick 9, and then probably pick 32 on Henry Hustwaite, which probably seems about fair. Zane Duursma is another interesting one, where there are rumours he potentially wants to leave North Melbourne because they haven't put the faith in him to be able to play. And then you've obviously got the family ties to him being at Essendon with Xavier Duursma, obviously coming from Port Adelaide a couple of years ago. There is also the concern maybe Willem Duursma goes interstate. I feel like Essendon, if that were to happen, would almost trade up and try use 2 of their picks if they do get Draper's Band 1 compensation to move all the way up, which is another story in of itself. But a potential trade, I feel like it could involve North Melbourne getting Jake Lever, because he's another one that's been rumoured to leave. I feel like if that were to happen, Duursma leaving, North Melbourne would want an experienced player and someone especially defensively to be able to come in and sort of help the likes of Comben and Pink and Logue, because they've been really poor, and even someone like Jackson Archer, who hasn't been in the team all the way through. And so I've got a mock trade here of North Melbourne getting a Jake Lever, Essendon getting Zane Duursma, and Melbourne getting North's 2026 second round pick. So essentially, Melbourne get a future second for Jake Lever, which is probably slightly overs. Essendon get Duursma, and North Melbourne get Jake Lever. It's a bit of a shuffle there. There's obviously going to be extra stuff added if this were to happen, and it's very unlikely, but I think for North Melbourne it improves them defensively. For Melbourne, they get a good pick for a player on the outer. Whether they would trade him and Stephen May is a concern there, because Stephen May is leaving, but there's obviously that stuff there. A couple outer players heading towards Carlton. Liam Reidy, he probably wouldn't cost more than a future 4. He's already 25. He's not a young ruckman, even though ruckmen do tend to be able to play older. He wouldn't be more than a future 4th because he's just of no real value. And then Campbell Chess is another one. If Carlton were to get him, it'd be quite interesting, because it's whether they trade a future 2nd potentially, or if he's not worth that anyway. Leek is another one heading to St Kilda. Him and Liam Ryan are the 2 trade options for St Kilda at the moment, aside from Sam Flanders, who I will touch upon shortly. According to Riley Beveridge, this has the hallmarks of being a preseason draft, which means it's not going to be a trade. But for Liam Ryan, is where things really get interesting, because when you look at it, West Coast will ask for an early second round pick. That's what they want. He's an experienced player. He's a good small forward. But St Kilda, they're going to argue, had injury problems, is towards the back end of his career. I think this probably gets done in a trade for where St Kilda gets something back for Rowan Marshall, which I'll get onto now because it sort of evolves into a 3-team trade in essence. I've got St Kilda here getting pick 20 and Liam Ryan. Rowan Marshall going to Geelong along with pick 49, and then West Coast get pick 42. So Geelong get Marshall and 49, and they give up pick 20 and 42. Obviously, this is after all the compensation picks come through. St Kilda get pick 20 and Liam Ryan for Rowan Marshall, and then West Coast get pick 42 for Liam Ryan, simply because he's not of that much value. And also with West Coast potentially needing to bid on some academy players towards the back end of the draft, it's just a few points extra for them. Callum Chee is another interesting one, where he and Branden Starcevich are the two people potentially leaving Brisbane this year to open up salary space for Sam Draper and Oscar Allen, who are both free agents. Callum Chee's value is really interesting because he's probably getting paid up to a late first, early second round pick, because you'd probably say he's close to about 750, 800, given Adelaide would need to lure him out. That's where the interesting thing comes around, because Brisbane are going to need points because they've got a pick in the top 5 at the moment, Daniel Annabelle, who's going to be a gun. And so that's probably why they're happy to let Archie leaves, but they wouldn't do anything other than a trade. So what I've got here is Brisbane get Adelaide's first round pick, but then they also give up a late second or early third as well to get that back. So Brisbane traded in a couple times last year to get some more picks, but because the draft value has changed so much since then, they will trade one of those to get another early pick. Adelaide probably get Cal Chee and a late pick. It might not be the same pick as a team like Fremantle might get involved, or Port Adelaide, because Port Adelaide and Fremantle want to get Will Brodie done. That deal is another one. That's probably just a late third, nothing really else there. It's just something simple. Port Adelaide might want to get back into this draft, and so whether they want to potentially trade up and get a first round pick is another interesting story. However, I don't have that here. But the other one that's really interesting from a Brisbane standpoint is Branden Starcevich and what he is worth. So as a free agent, which he is, Brisbane have the ability to match his offer, and that results in a trade. But because West Coast, they're losing Oscar Allen, the free agent compensation pick is a net in versus net out. So if they bring in Starcevich as a free agent, then unfortunately that pick 2 compensation isn't going to be worth enough to be able to come from the Oscar Allen pick, because it's a net in versus net out. It'd be diluted to maybe a start of second round pick, which isn't ideal for them. So what they would do is, part of their assistance package that they're asking from the AFL is an early second round pick or a late first round pick. And that would be similar to North Melbourne at the end of 2022, where they were forced to trade it. West Coast would do that, and they'd probably give up that and maybe a late second for Branden Starcevich, because he, with all the picks coming in and all the bids as well, it'd probably be pushed back to possibly mid-20s, that priority pick. So Brisbane will ask for something else. I think West Coast would be pretty comfortable with doing that. Could just be the pick that they get for Liam Ryan as well that comes back out. The last 2 players that I want to talk about are Sam Flanders. He has potentially looking at 4 different clubs at the moment. He's met with all 4, which are St Kilda, Melbourne, Essendon and Carlton. With each of those teams, there are different sections. With Melbourne, it would possibly involve a deal with Christian Petracca. There have been rumours that Petracca might go to the Suns. Michelangelo Richard was one who came out and was very bold with that. I don't think so. I think he's more likely to head to Adelaide, which I will also discuss shortly. But a deal for Flanders with Melbourne is going to be tough without involving Petracca going somewhere else. In terms of that deal, there's not much for Melbourne, because I don't think they would want to trade a future first. And they don't want to trade 2 years as well, because they don't have a pick this year. And so they'd be very confident in more so trying to trade back in rather than trade out future pieces. So unless they get a whole heap for Christian Petracca, I don't think that happens. With St Kilda, it seems to be looking like a future first. Carlton, we mentioned pick 7. However, I think that's slightly overs for someone like Sam Flanders, given we don't know if he is a full-time midfielder. And so the idea then would be St Kilda keep their pick this year. They're potentially targeting someone like a Jevan Philippou, who is Mateus Philippou's brother. So you keep that family connection, keep him happy. then also get a really good young player anyway. But then after that, you're probably looking at a future first, maybe the pick for Rowan Marshall. I mentioned pick 20 before. They're probably slightly under, so they might have to attach a future third. I think they've got pick 43, and that probably works for Sam Flanders. Carlton's an interesting one. Is it a straight swap for the TDK compo? I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like they might be more inclined to get in something as well for next year, which is the interesting thing because of the new changes that the AFL have made, or at least are planning to make with the draft bidding system next year. And then for Essendon, it'd probably involve one of their picks, given they're going to get so many in this year's draft. They've got 2 early first round picks. Whatever they get from Merrett is going to add on to that at least one more early first round pick this year. They could also be the Sam Draper compensation. Any of those would easily get the deal done. They might ask for something in return, but again, those 4 as a basis is probably a really good return for Gold Coast. Christian Petracca, I mentioned. If he goes to Adelaide, the thing here would be, it'd have to be 2 firsts. But if you're Adelaide, you wouldn't want to give that up necessarily for a 30 or nearly 30-year-old who has had a horrific injury. So they'd probably ask for maybe a pick back. I feel like Melbourne could get an extra pick in this year's draft, maybe a late second, and then Melbourne also give their second next year to Adelaide instead. So in the end, it'd be Christian Petracca and the 2026 second round pick in exchange for Melbourne's 2026 and 2027 first for pick 4, as well as pick 48, which they might get from a Chee trade on top of that. And then the last player I want to mention is probably the most pretentious one, and that is Charlie Curnow. He has been adamant he wants to leave. His priority is Geelong, and then Gold Coast, and then Sydney, which I find really interesting. Geelong have the least to be able to give up. They don't like trading away their first round picks. I believe they're the only club this year that have their own first, second, third, and fourth round picks. Gold Coast is another one. They're adamant that they don't want to trade Jed Walter or Ethan Reid, which I find questionable because you're in the Premiership window. You've just won a final, your first ever. You've got budding young stars. Imagine adding a 2-time Coleman medalist to that. Imagine the support you can provide to Ben King, which was probably your biggest weakness this year. You've got both of them in Jed Walter and Ethan Reid. That is the thing. If there was just one, I'd understand the hesitancy in wanting to trade him away. But the fact that you've got both of them and only one of them was in your best team at the end of the year, being Ethan Reid, it just makes so much sense that Jed Walter would be the piece going back. I wouldn't be surprised if it included both Walter and Flanders going to Carlton, or at least someone else. And then Jack Silvani compensation pick hangs back to Gold Coast as more points to be able to use for any bids that they have, because there are 2 in the top 5, more than likely. But I think for Curnow to go to Gold Coast, it has to involve one of those 2 key forwards for Carlton. Anything else, and they'd be getting way unders. And then for Sydney is the really interesting one. I think it's the most realistic landing spot personally. However, they also don't have a lot to give up. They've got their first round pick this year, which is probably pick 11 after the TDK and Allen compensation picks. They're probably going to have to give up a future first on top of that. But then there are issues around that's probably not enough for a 2-time Coleman medalist. And there are rumours that Ollie Florent could be the sort of deal breaker in a sense, where he's the one that opened things up for the trade. He was mentioned in a trade potentially earlier in the year with Harry Mackay in a straight swap, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. But I think he potentially fits on top of that, where Sydney would also then potentially include Jack Buller as another key forward, and that ends up going back to Collingwood. He ends up going to Collingwood. Collingwood's pick then potentially ends up back at Carlton or whoever. But that ends up being Sydney get Charlie Curnow for Ollie Florent, their pick 11 this year, their future first next year, and then Jack Buller. And then Carlton would get Ollie Florent, their Sydney's pick 11, Sydney's future first, and then also that 2026 fourth round pick for Jack Buller, which overall isn't bad, and I wouldn't be surprised if they end up potentially also trading up or trading out of this draft entirely. Do I see Charlie Curnow leaving? No, but I wouldn't be surprised if any of those deals happen. Geelong simply just don't have enough. They don't trade away their future first round picks. That's probably it. I don't really think there's anyone else really enough to talk about. Jordan Butts is one that could potentially leave, but Adelaide seem to want to hold him. Wade Dirkson's going, Max Heath's going, but he also is going to the preseason draft. I do thank you all for watching. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to this channel if you like this type of content, and I'll see you all guys next time.